Ethan Carter has always believed that his farm was more than just a patch of land. It was a living legacy. A decorated military veteran turned sustainable farmer, Ethan's Carter Acres spans rolling fields, a weathered barn, and an advanced irrigation system that channels precious water to every crop. For generations, his family has labored to cultivate this land using a blend of time-honored traditions and modern, eco-friendly techniques. To Ethan, every drop of water is sacred. His irrigation system isn't just technology, it's the lifeblood of his operation, ensuring that his organic produce flourishes and that his farm remains a testament to independence. Yet, in the midst of his pastoral paradise, a force of conformity looms large. Kerren, the self-appointed queen of the local homeowners association (HOA), has long patrolled the neighborhood with her clipboard and a relentless insistence on a cookie-cutter aesthetic. Dressed in immaculate suits with an ever-present air of superiority, Kerren believes that every property must adhere to her strict standards, no matter how unique or historic. To her, natural charm and independent expression are liabilities that must be controlled. The conflict ignited on an otherwise ordinary morning when Ethan discovered that water was mysteriously missing from his state-of-the-art irrigation system. After following the trail of disrupted channels and murky puddles in his fields, he learned with mounting horror that his water, essential for his crops, had been siphoned off. Rumor had it that Kerren herself had been spotted near the water controls early that day, apparently redirecting the flow to suit her own narrow vision of community order. Furious and feeling deeply violated, Ethan confronted Kerren at a routine HOA meeting later that day. "Kerren, how could you steal water from my irrigation system?" he demanded, his voice thick with indignation. "That water is the heart of my farm. Without it, my crops, my livelihood, my very legacy are at risk. I never gave you permission to tamper with my property." Kerren's response was as cold as it was condescending. "Ethan, the rules apply to everyone. If your property doesn't meet our community standards, corrective measures are necessary. I'm simply ensuring that no wasteful practices undermine the harmony of our neighborhood." Her tone brooked no argument, a declaration of power rather than an explanation. That confrontation marked the beginning of an all-out battle between Ethan's fiercely independent spirit and Kerren's relentless imposition of arbitrary rules. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Ethan stood by the parched fields, a mix of resolve and sorrow in his eyes. He knew that if Kerren's overreach continued unchecked, nothing on his farm would remain sacred. And so, with a quiet promise of justice whispering on the wind, Ethan vowed to fight for his legacy, no matter what Kerren or the HOA threw his way. The very next morning, Ethan found an official notice taped to his farmhouse door. The document, embossed with the HOA's crest and signed by Kerren herself, accused him of violating community water conservation standards because his irrigation system was now missing its rightful water supply. The notice demanded that he restore the water immediately or face a fine of $750. Every word was imbued with bureaucratic authority, a stark reminder that Kerren was determined to enforce her own vision of uniformity, regardless of individual rights. Ethan's heart pounded as he read the notice. To him, the water wasn't just a resource. It was a vital part of his family's heritage and the engine that powered Carter Acres. Refusing to be bullied, he gathered county water rights regulations, local zoning laws, and historical records that clearly affirmed his legal entitlement to the water. With this evidence in hand, Ethan drafted a formal complaint disputing the fine and questioning the legitimacy of the HOA's interference. As a light mist cleared from the fields, a sleek sedan pulled up along his gravel driveway. Two uniformed inspectors emerged, clipboards in hand, and approached his irrigation controls with the cold precision of bureaucrats. "Mr. Carter," one intoned in a monotone, "we're here on behalf of the HOA to verify that your property complies with our water conservation standards." Meeting them at the door, Ethan replied evenly, "My irrigation system has been maintained in strict accordance with local law and sustainable practices. I have all the documentation to prove it." Despite his thorough explanation and the copies of regulations he provided, The inspectors dutifully measured, noted discrepancies, and recorded every detail, bound by Kerren's unyielding orders. Shortly thereafter, Kerren herself arrived, her presence as imposing as ever in a sharply tailored suit, clipboard at the ready. "Ethan, you must understand. If you don't restore your water supply immediately, you will incur further penalties. The rules apply to everyone without exception," she declared in a tone that brooked no argument. Her words stung, and as she strode away, Ethan's resolve deepened. That evening, as rain softly pattered against his windows, he sat down with his legal texts and zoning ordinances. He realized that this was not about saving water. It was about enforcing Kerren's draconian control. Determined to protect his legacy, he vowed that if the HOA continued to encroach on his rights, he would document every step and prepare for a battle that would challenge the very foundations of arbitrary power. Over the following days, Kerren's tactics escalated into a full-blown campaign of intimidation. What began as a single notice soon evolved into a barrage of fines and threats. Ethan discovered multiple violation notices affixed to various parts of his property, each citing a new infraction such as improper water usage, unsanitary irrigation practices, and failure to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. The language was merciless and legalistic, designed solely to pressure him into compliance. Rumors spread like wildfire among the neighbors. Several residents, who had always admired Ethan's commitment to sustainable farming, revealed that they too had received similar notices for minor deviations that had never before been enforced. Whispers suggested that Kerren was using the HOA's funds for her personal vendettas, and that fines were being levied arbitrarily to instill fear. Determined to expose the truth behind these actions, Ethan installed discreet cameras near his irrigation system and along the water channels. Over the next several days, he captured damming footage, inspectors arriving unannounced, measuring water flow, and attaching yet another violation notice to a pump housing. One particularly damning clip showed an inspector meticulously checking the water pressure and scribbling furiously in his notebook as though evaluating a public monument rather than a private system. Ethan compiled every piece of evidence, photographs of the notices, video recordings of intrusive inspections, and even anonymous tips from sympathetic neighbors, into a comprehensive dossier. His files painted a damning portrait of Kerren's campaign. It was not about water conservation or community aesthetics. It was about control and intimidation. When the next HOA board meeting was announced, the tension in the community was palpable. Homeowners, many of whom had suffered similar harassment, gathered in a packed meeting hall, armed with printed copies of Ethan's dossier. As Ethan took the stage, he calmly recounted the timeline of violations and presented his evidence in a clear, methodical manner. The room fell silent as each piece of proof undercut Kerren's authority, and even some board members exchanged uneasy glances. By the end of the meeting, it was evident that what began as a dispute over water was now a battle for the fundamental right to manage one's property without arbitrary interference. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the collective determination of the community to stand up against Kerren's tyranny was stronger than ever. One crisp morning, as Ethan was making his routine rounds by his irrigation system, he discovered an outrageous new development. Kerren had somehow commandeered a significant portion of his water supply to wash her car at the edge of his property. In an attempt to enforce her strict idea of cleanliness, she had redirected water from his carefully maintained channels for her own personal use. To Ethan, this wasn't just theft. It was a brazen violation of his rights and an affront to his sustainable farming practices. Furious, Ethan inspected the damage. His irrigation system, which had faithfully nourished his crops for years, had been tampered with, leaving parts of his fields dangerously dry. In response, Ethan decided that if Kerren was going to steal his water, he would send her a message she couldn't ignore. Drawing on his ingenuity and his commitment to innovation, he reprogrammed his irrigation system to divert water into a batch of liquid fertilizer, a substance that, while beneficial for his crops, would wreak havoc if misused. At precisely the right moment, Ethan activated his modified system. Instead of clear, life-giving water, the channels now delivered a nutrient-rich liquid fertilizer directly onto the area where Kerren had been using his water to wash her car. The hot, chemical mixture quickly spread across the spot, rendering it unusable for her purposes and leaving a clear, visible marker of his defiance. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors who had witnessed the scene cheered, and photos and videos of the fertilizer-coated car quickly spread on social media. The image of Kerren, fuming at the sight of her car splattered with liquid fertilizer, became an instant viral sensation, a symbol of poetic justice for all who had suffered under her arbitrary rule. Ethan's calculated move was not merely an act of retaliation. It was a declaration that his property and his resources were not to be trifled with. By transforming stolen water into a tool for reclaiming control, he sent a clear message. If you try to abuse my property, you'll be met with consequences that you won't soon forget. The incident galvanized the community, with more residents voicing their support for Ethan and their outrage at the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Kerren's overreach had inadvertently united the neighborhood in its determination to protect their individual rights. The stage was set for a full-scale showdown between personal freedom and bureaucratic tyranny. Desperate to salvage her dwindling authority, Kerren resolved to take one last extreme measure. That evening, still seething over the humiliation of having her car doused in fertilizer, she picked up the phone and called the local police. In her frantic call, she falsely claimed that Ethan's reckless irrigation practices were endangering the community's water supply and creating a public health hazard. It was a last-ditch effort to leverage law enforcement against Ethan and to reassert her control over the neighborhood. Within minutes, a police patrol arrived at Carter Acres. The officers, maintaining their professional detachment, met Ethan calmly at the farmhouse. With a steady voice, Ethan presented copies of his permits, zoning documents, and records of his previous communications with the HOA, all of which clearly demonstrated that his irrigation system was operating legally and sustainably. The officers examined the evidence and even praised the efficiency of his system, ultimately dismissing Kerren's complaint as baseless. But Kerren wasn't finished yet. In a final desperate bid to discredit Ethan, she secretly hired a private investigator to gather evidence of mismanagement on his part. Late that night, while most of the community slept, the PI attempted to sneak onto Ethan's property. However, Sam strategically placed security cameras captured every moment. The footage showed the PI trespassing and triggering alarms, further underscoring that Kerren was willing to break the law to salvage her power. At the next HOA meeting, with the entire neighborhood in attendance, Ethan took the stage once more. With calm resolve, he played the incriminating footage on a large screen. This evidence, he declared, proves that Kerren's desperate actions have crossed the line from aggressive oversight to criminal trespass. Instead of protecting our community, she's been abusing her power for personal vendettas. The room fell into stunned silence as gasps and murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Kerren attempted to offer weak excuses, insisting her actions were for the good of the community, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the close of the meeting, it was clear that Kerren's final, desperate move had backfired catastrophically. Under mounting pressure from local authorities and the unyielding scrutiny of the community, Kerren was issued a trespassing citation, a final, decisive blow to her credibility. Her days as the tyrannical enforcer were numbered. In the aftermath of Kerren's humiliation and her disastrous final move, the community's long-held frustration erupted into organized rebellion. An emergency town hall meeting was convened at the local community center, a stark, fluorescent-lit room that, on that day, became the battleground for the residents' revolt against arbitrary authority. Frustrated homeowners, tired of Kerren's endless fines and invasive inspections, gathered in large numbers, armed with copies of Ethan's comprehensive dossier, photographs, video recordings, and personal testimonies documenting every instance of her overreach. One by one, residents recounted their experiences of being bullied and fined for trivial deviations, and the collective anger in the room was palpable, a resounding chorus that declared, "Enough is enough." After hours of impassioned debate, the community voted unanimously to dissolve the current HOA board and remove Kerren from her position as president. The decision was swift and decisive, a clear rejection of the oppressive regime that had long stifled their individuality. Local media quickly heralded the event as the fall of the HOA tyrant, and city officials launched an independent investigation into the board's financial practices. It soon emerged that funds had been misappropriated to support Kerren's personal vendettas, and countless fines had been imposed solely to intimidate those who dared to live on their own terms. For Ethan, the collapse of the HOA was a moment of quiet vindication. Sitting on his porch one crisp morning, he sipped his coffee as the sun rose over his reclaimed property, a property now free from the oppressive dictates of Kerren's regime. Across the neighborhood, the dark shadow of bureaucratic tyranny had lifted, replaced by a vibrant spirit of unity and self-determination. Following the community's decisive vote and the dramatic collapse of the corrupt HOA board, the full force of the law was unleashed on those responsible. City inspectors and independent auditors conducted a meticulous review of the board's financial records and enforcement practices, uncovering a tangled web of misappropriated funds and baseless fines imposed solely to serve Kerren's personal agenda. Money earmarked for community improvements had been diverted, and fines were levied without any just cause. Armed with overwhelming evidence, a coalition of aggrieved homeowners, led by Ethan, filed a class action lawsuit against the former board. In a series of public hearings, Ethan presented his meticulously compiled dossier: video footage of intrusive inspections, photographs of absurd violation notices, and internal communications exposing systematic abuse of power. The courtroom became the stage for the community's collective voice, and the judge's verdict was swift and unequivocal. Heavy fines were imposed on the board members. Several individuals faced criminal charges for fraud and mismanagement, and all misappropriated funds were ordered to be redirected toward community development projects. Moreover, the settlement mandated that a new, democratically elected board be established to govern transparently in the future. Local headlines soon blared "Fall of the HOA Tyrants," and the case became a beacon of hope for communities resisting arbitrary authority. For Ethan and his neighbors, the legal victory was not merely about financial restitution. It was a powerful reclamation of their autonomy and a clear declaration that no one is above the law. With the legal verdict and public humiliation now firmly in place, Kerren's personal world crumbled rapidly. Once the iron-fisted enforcer of the HOA's draconian rules, she was now exposed as a petty, overreaching bully whose actions had brought shame upon her and the entire board. Forced to resign from her position as president, Kerren found herself isolated as former allies and board members distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her tarnished legacy. Her stately home, a symbol of the status she once so proudly maintained, was soon put on the market amid swirling rumors of financial ruin, and whispers spread that her longtime partner had finally abandoned her, unable to withstand the relentless pressure and public disgrace. Her attempts to secure even a modest role in property management were met with derision. At local job fairs, potential employers exchanged skeptical glances whenever her name was mentioned, and the community's scorn was palpable. In one particularly humiliating moment at a city hall meeting, Kerren desperately tried to justify her actions as necessary for community order, but her feeble explanations were met with laughter and pointed remarks from the residents. Kerren's personal downfall became a living cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is immune from accountability when power is abused. For Ethan, witnessing Kerren's collapse was a quiet, deeply satisfying moment of poetic justice. There was no overt celebration, only a measured satisfaction that tyranny eventually crumbles under the united spirit of a community determined to live free. Kerren's ruin became a symbol of the inevitable downfall of unchecked authority. As autumn deepened into a crisp, clear evening, the community of Carter Acres embraced a new era of freedom and unity. The dark days of arbitrary fines, invasive inspections, and oppressive HOA mandates were now relegated to cautionary tales, an ugly chapter that had finally been closed. Ethan sat on his porch, the warm glow of the setting sun reflecting off his reclaimed property, a quiet smile on his face as he recalled the long, hard-fought battle. At a celebratory block party held in the community park, neighbors gathered to toast their victory over bureaucratic tyranny. Laughter and lively conversation filled the air as residents recounted humorous anecdotes about past misdeeds, especially the day when Kerren, attempting her usual inspection of his boat for a quick ride, was forced to relinquish it to the Coast Guard. In one particularly playful moment, a longtime friend produced a comically oversized HOA violation notice, accusing Ethan of excessive maritime vigilance and unauthorized Coast Guard coordination. With a wry grin, Ethan accepted the faux citation and quipped, "I guess they really did try." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, a final, resounding mic drop on an era of oppression. As twilight deepened and the party wound down, families and friends lingered, discussing plans for a future built on transparency, innovation, and mutual respect. The oppressive rules that once loomed over Carter Acres were replaced by a community-led governance system that celebrated individuality and safeguarded personal rights. Sitting quietly on his porch as the last light faded, Ethan reflected on the journey. His boat, once stolen for a quick ride, and later reclaimed with the help of the Coast Guard, stood as a proud emblem of his independence. The legacy of HOA Kerren's petty reign had been consigned to a cautionary tale, and the united spirit of the community shone brighter than ever. Fade to black.